The thing that I see more and more when it comes to people, especially among people who claim to have knowledge about the human being, or to claim to have understanding about human psychology or whatever, is that they actually cannot see their own interpretation machine. And if you don't see your own interpretation machine, the interpretation machine in the human brain, which is a very important and central part of the human program, as I have explained many times, if you really cannot see your own interpretation machine, then you actually don't know much about what the human being is. It's just a fact, and it's very sad that people refuse to see their own interpretation machine, because for them it's a threat to see their own interpretation machine, because they think that, oh my God, does it mean that I'm not right in my conclusions? Does it mean that I'm self-delusional, that I'm making up my own so-called conclusions about the world? Yes, honey, that's what it means. This is the first step in understanding and deciphering the human being and the human program. From university professors to normal laymen, from normal workers and sleepers and resters and meditators and walkers and babies and adolescents and grown-ups, or so-called grown-ups, to professionals, to psychologists, psychiatrists, and professors. They simply just cannot see their own interpretation machine. And if you don't see your own interpretation machine, then you are ignorant. It's just the way it is. And most people are ignorant. Doesn't matter if you're Jordan Peterson or another person who has gotten some confirmation of their position, so to speak, but at the same time shows very often a very narrow and limited view of what human psychology really is. Because human psychology is dependent, completely dependent on identification models. It depends on what does the self identify as. You have to understand that the self can identify within a multitude of models. It's practically not even models. The self can identify in many different ways, and we can identify as the person that we think that we are, which is the psychological self that we have developed over time, or we can identify as a fixed self, so to speak, or we can identify as the host of a variety of self-states, in a way, or self-models, or self-domains or paradigms, so to speak. There's a variety of ways for the self to identify, and there's a big variety of possibilities for us to let or allow the self to identify. So psychology is hugely dependent on identification. If you identify as the psychological self, then you can determine what kind of person or what kind of psychological self that you find appropriate to identify with and as. But you can identify as other things as that. You can identify as the host, as the space that holds the different identities, the different parts in your life. Like in the IFS model, for instance, you can identify as the self, the main self, the father self, the mother self, that is a host for the other personality parts within you that are simply parts of your personality, but they are quite separate. They are separate beings in a way. They are separate souls, separate personalities that work together and give utterances to the main self, You can identify as one of these parts, or you can identify as the host for the variety of these parts, for the multitude of these parts. Whether they are 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, doesn't matter. And that also will depend on other parts of the psychology, which is brain dependent. My point is that all of this is brain dependent, because psychology that only goes into the mind is no real psychology, because psychology is basically first and foremost about the brain as well, because the brain is the root of all psychology. The mind is just a domain that the brain creates. The mind is a domain of certain mind realities that is created by an engine that is deeper than that. And the engine that is deeper than the mind is, of course, the brain and the subconscious mind, the brain that we cannot see. So, to say it short, and to give an overview of what you have to do if you want to understand the human being, and if you want to be a competent person to speak about psychology, is to understand the interpretation machine within the human program. You have to understand what part of your personality or the workings of your brain is constituting and creating the interpretation machine. What is the results of the interpretation machine? In what way does it interpret? What does that mean for our projections, the thing that we believe in, because we believe in our projections, right? That's the carrot in front of the donkey. And Buddhist philosophy tells us that this is a carrot in front of the donkey, so please don't attach too hard to that carrot, baby, because it may lead you astray and you're going to get a headache from it. You know, this is just grown-up knowledge. So if you want to be a grown-up, you have to understand your own interpretation machine. And the reason why people don't want to understand this is because it shakes the foundation of their self-identification. But the self-identification, the different self-identifications that we have, or the one that is in operation or the most dominant, should be allowed to be flexible, or it should be allowed to oscillate as a reality and as a non-reality, because also in Buddhist thought or in insight research, we see that, of course, that the self is something that is created by ourselves. And if we are going to be scientific about this, we will have to say that the self is actually an experience of that which is constituted by synaptic activity in the brain. The self is actually an experience of a process that is happening in the brain, synaptic activity. The self is the result of 2 points in the brain releasing biochemicals and neurotransmitters together. You know, that's the self for you. If we're talking about neuroscience or the different activities that we cannot see but which still happens within our neurocircuitry, right? That was a piece of poetry. Well, so that's just how it is. If you cannot understand or see, and if you're not even willing to see your own interpretation machine, that means that you're a narcissist, and you're ignorant, and you're not capable or grown up enough to see yourself, and you should be able to do more responsible homework about yourself and about the human program before you expose your grandiose visions to the world. Or not. I like grandiose visions, and everything is hunky-dory, everything's fine. But don't be an idiot, don't be stupid. Recognize the fact that this is mental phenomena, and mental phenomena is fleeting, it's temporary, it's created by the instrument which is the human program. Without the human program there would be no mental phenomena, because the human program means the brain and the nervous system, and therefore our ability to create mind phenomena and mental phenomena by the consciousness that is created by the organism which gives us life. So this is something to say about people who are so-called professionals and so-called professors and so-called doctors and so-called psychiatrists or so-called psychologists or whatever, who has too little. They are deficient. They have a deficiency. They are deficient about the knowledge of the brain. And the most important part for them to understand and see with their own eyes is the interpretation machine within the human program. Because the perception machine is always working. That is feeding the perception machine. Our perception is feeding our consciousness with information. Then, because we have to survive in this world, the human brain, which has developed over millions of years, has installed an interpretation machine so that we can survive in this world, And that interpretation machine is responsible for many of our conclusions, for a lot of our thinking, for a lot of our ideas. And these ideas that are a product of the interpretation machine is the material that is going into the projection machine. And then we make the projection machine and we believe in our projections. And that's human life for you. That's humanity for you. That's the story of mankind. And if we cannot see the story of mankind as the journey from perception machine to interpretation machine to projection machine, if we cannot see this journey, the road from perception to interpretation to projection, if you cannot see that process, then you cannot see the human being. And then it means that we have to allow a greater degree of reflection and insight before we really enter the public arena with our so-called knowledge. Because we want to do it in a professional way, in an enlightened way, in a grown-up way, and then we have to accept the existence of the human program that creates or gives space and possibility and is the host, so to speak, for the products of the human program, for our thinking, for our feelings, for our emotions, for the way that we relate to experience, to past trauma, to many things. All of these things which influences the brain in a way that again influences the interpretation machine within the human mind-brain system. And this is very important to see. Thank you.